RHI has been described as the biggest financial blunder in the history of Northern Ireland. Cash for ash. A public inquiry has spent the last 12 months examining exactly what went wrong.
I do solemnly swear
that the evidence that I shall give to this inquiry,
Dozens of witnesses have been questioned.
Will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Tens of thousands of documents compiled. And political careers left in jeopardy.
I'm accountable, perhaps, for what my special advisor does, but I'm not responsible for it.
I think that Arlene Foster's career is now essentially in the hands of Sir Patrick Coughlin.
The shadowy world of special advisors has been subjected to scrutiny.
I respect the fact that he has a different recollection. I don't know why he has that recollection.
I suspect in this case, because it was my cousin, my guard was down, I shouldn't have done it.
An apparently blasé disregard for the law has been laid bare.
It was our decision, or the Sinn Féin decision, not to yield at all to the actions of Mr. Allister and Mr. Allister's act.
And a beleaguered civil service has had its reputation shredded.
I have to acknowledge that multiple failings, multiple mistakes were made, and that we should have done better.
With witness hearings now closed, tonight, Spotlight reports on an inquiry which has shone a light on Stormont like never before.
That's politics, I'm afraid. It's a grubby world.
That's something of an understatement.
Two years ago, this programme revealed the massive consequences of a green energy scheme called the Renewable Heat Incentive, or RHI. Spotlight explained how the Department of Enterprise, under Arlene Foster, had made a series of catastrophic blunders. At the heart of the scheme was a fatal flaw, the lack of anything like sufficient control. It meant the department ended up with a scheme where the more you burn, the more you earn. Cash for ash. Businesses signing up for wood pellet boilers were paid £1.60 for every pound they spent on fuel.
It's almost like burning the money.
Faced with an overspend of almost £500 million, desperate officials pleaded in vain for the Treasury to bail them out. When Spotlight revealed the concerns of a whistleblower who'd alerted Arlene Foster about the scheme, the DUP's Nigel Dodds tried to dismiss the whistleblower's significance.
The fact of the matter is we've now managed to get our hands on the original email correspondence that was sent in to Arlene by the so-called whistleblower, and in fact it shows...
Why so-called whistleblower?
Well, because a whistleblower has to raise a particular issue of concern in relation to the RHI issue. And the central allegation was, oh, this was raised with Arlene, she passed it on, and nothing further was done. In fact, in the email correspondence, the issue was not raised with Arlene. It was a general query.
But within days, Arlene Foster was forced to concede the whistleblower had indeed raised concerns about RHI.
A subsequent email to my private account the following week has now come to light, in which there is a reference to concerns about the scheme.
The Ulster Unionist leader Mike Nesbitt has called for the First Minister Arlene Foster to consider resigning over her involvement.
The ensuing crisis was like no other, dominating the headlines for weeks.
It's been called one of the biggest financial scandals in the history of Northern Ireland,
which could cost Stormont £400 million.
Which isn't going to burn out anytime soon.
Sinn Féin demanded Arlene Foster step aside while an investigation took place. She stood firm.
The record shows that I have worked hard to keep Northern Ireland moving forward, and I will continue to do so as First Minister.
In the end, Sinn Féin pulled the plug, citing a series of DUP-linked scandals.
Things like Red Sky, Frank Cusnahan and Nama, the Leafa decision, despicable decision, the RHI. All of these things are hugely concerning for us in Sinn Féin. There will be no return to the status quo.
Martin McGuinness's resignation meant the end of the executive, with no signs, nearly 2 years on, of its return. This room used to host meetings of Assembly committees. Now it's where an inquiry into RHI has been holding its hearings, and it's been exploring if the hugely costly flaws of the scheme were accidental or by design. But the inquiry has also provided many insights into how Stormont was run, particularly by the DUP, the party under whose watch the scheme was conceived and delivered with such disastrous consequences for the public purse. Front and centre of this story right from the start is the DUP leader Arlene Foster. She was the minister at the Department of Enterprise when it developed and launched the fatally flawed scheme in late 2012. But she has always denied responsibility, claiming she did what was right, given what she knew at the time.
Will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
Thank you. I acted appropriately in the circumstances, certainly from my rereading of things I didn't see at that particular point in time.
The newsletter's Sam McBride has broken many RHI stories and watched almost every minute of the inquiry.
I think in very crude terms, the sense that Arlene Foster projected around the time of Spotlight, around the time when this was a huge scandal in December 2016, was essentially, why are you looking at me? This isn't my fault. This was the fault of the civil service.
You do have a seat, Mrs. Foster.
More than a year later, on her first day in the chair at the inquiry, Arlene Foster wasn't moving from that position. The blame didn't lie with her, but with those who worked for her.
I think that if I had have been made aware of various issues, then I would have acted differently.
So are there any particular things then that you feel that you didn't do, that you could have done or should have done?
None that spring to mind at present.
But when the inquiry began to probe Arlene Foster, it made an astonishing discovery.
In conclusion, I ask that members support the passage of these regulations that outline the arrangements for the Northern Ireland RHI.
She'd asked the Assembly to pass RHI, a scheme worth hundreds of millions of pounds, without ever reading the legislation.
No, I didn't, so there's absolutely not. I didn't read the regulations.
It's boring to read legislation. It's difficult. It's not particularly thrilling material to get through, but it's part of the job. These are people who are paid handsomely. They're paid to do this job. This is part of that job. And I think the idea that simply because you thought somebody else had done it for you, you didn't have to do it, it's not really good enough. The minister was going into the legislature. She was asking MLAs to trust her that this was the right thing to do. She was trying to persuade them to vote for this legislation. The fact that she hadn't even read it, I think, is a damning indictment on her as a minister.
The RHI scheme got up and running with its perverse incentive of the more you burn, the more you earn. And when the inquiry looked back at this period, many gave evidence claiming not to have noticed the problem. But the inquiry also heard that later, when the whistleblower, or as she prefers to be known, the concerned citizen, Jeanette O'Hagan, came forward to warn Arlene Foster about it, her very clear concerns were effectively ignored by Mrs. Foster's civil servants.
I told him what my concerns were about, the potential abuse, and we don't think people will do that. That will stay with me to the day I die. We don't think people will do that.
At the inquiry, Arlene Foster blamed her officials for not doing enough about the whistleblower's concerns.
I don't think she was believed in terms of the fact that people would just put in an installation to get a subsidy. I don't think that that was believed within the department, and as a result of that, her meeting wasn't taken as seriously as it should have been.
In dealing with these kinds of issues, Arlene Foster says she expected this man to be her eyes and ears, Andrew Crawford. He was drawn from the ranks of the DUP to assist the minister as her special advisor, what's known as a SPAD. SPADs earned up to £92,000. But like Mrs. Foster, he also preferred to point the finger at civil servants.
I have no doubt if key documents and key information was brought to the Minister's attention and brought to my attention, I believe if they had have been brought to her attention, none of us would have been in this room today.
But Andrew Crawford did have to say sorry for leaking confidential government documents, including to his own family.
Was I in habit of leaking consultation documents? No, I wasn't. However, I suspect in this case, because it was my cousin, my guard was down. I shouldn't have done it. I can't answer it. I apologise for it.
Arlene Foster said she knew nothing about his activities and, as with her civil servants, once again refused to take the blame.
If an individual acts outside of what they should be doing, in other words, they act outside of the code that is there to guide them, then they've stepped outside of the rules and have broken those rules. I am accountable for that breach, but I fail to see how he could be responsible for that breach. If he had committed a criminal offence as a special advisor, I wouldn't think that the panel would be asking me to be responsible for that. I'm accountable, perhaps, for what my special advisor does, but I'm not responsible for it.
Accountable, but not responsible. A play on words which has left many observers scratching their heads. Was she taking some blame or not? John Tong is a professor of politics who has specialised in researching the DUP.
The mandate was with Arlene Foster. She was a democratically elected MLA, placed in government as a minister. So ultimately the buck does stop with Arlene Foster, however unfortunate she may have been.
Mr. Bell was not good.
And if the inquiry finds that the buck does indeed stop with her, what of her future as DUP leader?
I think there are several key people in the DUP who are eagerly waiting the outcome of this inquiry. They are waiting to see exactly what it says about Arlene Foster, but I think that they know that it will be critical of Arlene Foster. There will be then a natural point at which to move against her. If she survives that, I think that will be very significant, but that is the point of acute vulnerability for her. She has been allowed, if you like, to survive as quite a weak leader for a long time now within the party, but there are other people who are looking at this within the DUP with complete dismay. There are people within the DUP who look at the evidence that she didn't read the legislation, and not just that she didn't read the legislation, but that she said that in almost a blasé way to the inquiry, that she didn't seem to think that was a particularly alarming or embarrassing thing to admit, and they're just aghast.
The role of special advisors like Andrew Crawford has been one of the big stories of this inquiry. We've learned a lot about how these highly paid but unelected advisors exerted huge power at the heart of government, and we've learned in particular how some DUP SPADs like to play rough. They were supposed to be temporary civil servants acting in the wider public interest, and the inquiry will now have to decide if their behaviour fell short of what was required. We've learned from the inquiry that members of Andrew Crawford's family had 11 RHI boilers between them.
I never said to you, is it worthwhile me putting in these boilers in this scheme?
No, I never went into financials. Does this pay? Does it not pay?
I do solemnly and sincerely declare and affirm.
Then there's Timothy Cairns, a former religious minister, and a man who tried to impose his will on his boss, Jonathan Bell, calling him big balls in front of 100 other people trying to enjoy their breakfast.
Just trying to diffuse the whole thing, and it clearly was a disaster on my part.
Of the evidence I shall give to this inquiry.
Stephen Brimstone, who said he got a boiler because an electric heater gave him a headache, and said he forgot to declare his interest in this scheme.
From both a personal and professional perspective, if I had to do it again, I wouldn't have went anywhere near it. You're absolutely right, the perception and all of that. You just need to be so careful when you're in a public role.
It'll be the truth, the whole truth.
John Robinson, who failed to declare that his father-in-law had a boiler and had to step aside from dealing with RHI issues.
I do have a sense of guilt around catapulting not only my own family, but my wife's family into the media spotlight.
It'll be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing.
And Timothy Johnston, Robinson's brother-in-law, the most senior spad of all. On his first day before the inquiry, he suggested he'd had little knowledge of RHI at a significant point in the process, only to have that thrown into question when he next appeared by the dramatic emergence of new evidence.
In looking at that email there, that email doesn't spring to me to say, oh right, you were closely involved in RHI. I take that email to be, Tim, you've been away on your holidays, you've come back, you've a lot of other stuff on, we need to talk about RHI.
I think outside the Stormont bubble, I think before this, very few people would have even known that SPADs existed. They wouldn't have recognised the term. Now the term is so recognised and is so closely associated with bad behaviour or dodgy behaviour or behaviour that is not seen to be quite right and proper within government, that I think it's almost a pejorative term, it's almost a term of abuse.
Many of these SPADs were brought on board by Peter Robinson. While party leader, and for many years as deputy, he was constantly gathering new blood, mostly bullish young men.
Hold on. Can't even walk his own constitution. Hold on. Fantasy land. Run away, Trimble. Run away.
Timothy Johnston, who's been called the ace of SPADs, was the closest advisor of all to Peter Robinson before and during his reign as First Minister. This is him in 2003, when the DUP and Ulster Unionists clashed during an election campaign. When power was devolved in 2007, Johnston was special advisor to Ian Paisley. Johnston, Robinson's man, has denied allegations, including from the Paisley family, that he was central to the move to oust the party's iconic founder as First Minister.
In the ultimate act of ruthlessness, the party leader for decades, the party founder, is in effect sidelined for the sake of a new leader who will lead the DUP in government rather than the DUP in opposition that they'd been for so many years.
So Timothy Johnston was Ian Paisley's special advisor, but in your view was instrumental in getting rid of him?
Special advisors are brought in to be ruthless. Timothy Johnston, you could certainly apply the label ruthless.
When Peter Robinson was First Minister, his most trusted and loyal lieutenant, Johnston, was at his side throughout as SPAD. Peter Robinson paid tribute to both Johnston and another senior SPAD, Richard Bullock, in his last party conference speech.
Some refer to them as staff, officials, and even some as special advisors. I've always seen them as just being part of the leadership team. I couldn't have functioned without them. Half the time they propped me up, the rest of the time they carried me completely. And nobody will mind if I single out Richard Bullock and Timothy Johnston.
While the cerebral Richard Bullock was thought of as one of the brains of Robinson's operation, Timothy Johnston brought brains and a fearsome reputation as a party manager. And the inquiry has heard that even though he has never been elected, his power within the party now is unmatched.
There's not one elected representative, not one party employee or special advisor who did not recognise that Mr Johnston was very much at the top of the tree within the Democratic Unionist Party.
Yes. The inquiry repeatedly heard claims that Timothy Johnston was right at the top of a very controlling and centralised DUP structure. But when it was his turn in this chair, he preferred to focus on how politics was a complicated and difficult business especially here at Stormont.
I just make the wider point, and I probably will make it on a number of occasions. You come back to weighing up what is in the greater good, and I'm not saying that the means justify the ends, but what I'm saying is that you ended up on many occasions getting good outcomes for Northern Ireland, for people on the street, to take the chairman's phrase, and you weighed that with a greater weight in the balance than maybe the ugliness of how you got there.
Some of that ugliness was laid bare when the inquiry heard how rules governing both the appointment and conduct of special advisors were routinely broken at Stormont. Those were a result of a private member's bill brought by Jim Allister in 2013.
The more I got into and studied the subject of special advisors, the more I realised it was far too loosely unregulated, because it seemed to me that it was operating on who you know basis. It was jobs for the boys, above all.
The inquiry heard evidence that in 2015, one of these so-called jobs for the boys was ultimately decided by Peter Robinson.
It was Mr. Robinson who called me into his office and said, whilst we're also reshuffling ministers, we're going to reshuffle special advisors as well. And he had said, you know, I've decided that so-and-so is going to go to such and such.
Jim Allister's bill meant that in future, SPADs were supposed to be appointed on merit and by the minister and not by the party. In fact, the DUP helped vote through the bill, but then just carried on as before. And that disregard for legislation which had passed through the Assembly was a point the inquiry chair returned to again and again.
That cannot be a satisfactory situation from a democratic point of view.
No, I accept from a transparency point of view, from a democratic point of view, that...
Not just transparency, but you have a provision that sets out what you should be doing to democratically reflect the will of the Northern Ireland people. And you're not doing that, quite the reverse.
No, I accept that. I think as time went on, things become very comfortable in the sense of how our party and other parties appointed these positions.
The inquiries heard how dubious practice regarding special advisors wasn't just confined to the DUP. The main purpose of Jim Allister's legislation was to prevent anyone with a serious criminal conviction from becoming a special advisor. But when Sinn Féin's Martin O'Muller gave evidence, he indicated that his party simply sidestepped that new law. One special advisor, who was now banned from the role, continued in his job under a different title, now paid for out of party funds. The man in question was Aidan McAteer, a former prisoner. He'd worked as an advisor to Martin McGuinness from when he was Education Minister in the early days of devolution. The inquiry heard that after Jim Allister's law, McAteer still had a role in managing and directing special advisors, which by law he should no longer have had.
What you would have to say is, because of this code, which is mandatory, which is transparent and democratic and flows from an act, you should not carry out this management, control and coordination function in relation to those who are paid from public funds.
Well, I have to say that it was our decision, the Sinn Féin decision, not to yield at all to the actions of Mr. Allister and Mr. Allister's act.
But it was the evidence of Martin O'Muller's email consultation with two of Gerry Adams' closest confidants which sparked the greatest surprise: Padraig Wilson and Ted Howell. Mr. Adams mentioned both of them in a recent light-hearted promotional video for a new cookery book written by him with contributions from his kitchen cabinet.
We fed ourselves. Ted Howell, an outstanding cook. Padraig Wilson, a really wonderful maker of delicate little milshogi sweets, desserts. They fed us. for years and years and years.
Padraig Wilson is a former leader of the IRA and the Maze, who in recent years has been charged with IRA membership. The court ordered an acquittal. Ted Howell is a senior Sinn Féin backroom figure, little known but very significant in the Republican movement, instrumental in a succession of negotiations. It was put to Martino Muller that as finance minister, he had to seek the permission of Howell, an unelected advisor, before making a key decision.
You're essentially asking Ted Howell, is he content that you do what all of those officials by that point are recommending that you do?
Well, no, I would reject that. I'm telling Ted Howell that my decision has now been made. We have probed this. We have exhausted it.
On big issues like welfare reform, there were points at which the DUP alleged that there was outside interference, that there was another structure within Sinn Féin that got involved in these things. But here we have people at a day-to-day basis constantly being kept in the loop, where the civil service have advised, take this decision, but the minister wants advice from somebody outside the structure who's not an expert in energy, who's not a legal expert, but for some other reason has to be involved.
Sinn Féin told Spotlight Padraig Wilson is a member of what's known as its 6-county executive, and it said it would have been absurd for a Sinn Féin minister not to consult senior party colleagues. 5 special advisors have sat in this room over the past couple of months and generated huge headlines. But let's not forget that for day after day and week after week, it was civil servants who were sitting in here being quizzed about how a scheme they were responsible for running became such a catastrophe. It's revealed an organisation in disarray. The current head of the civil service is David Sterling. In 2012, he was the most senior civil servant in the Department of Enterprise at the first key stage of RHI when it was launched. But it was his evidence about how the culture of the civil service was shaped by the DUP and Sinn Féin which raised eyebrows. He spoke of how officials stopped taking notes of meetings simply because they felt the two big parties preferred them not to.
A feature of the devolved administration here has been that the two main parties have been sensitive to criticism. And I think it's in that context that as a senior civil service, we got into the habit of not recording all meetings on the basis that it is safer sometimes not to have a record that, for example, might be released under freedom of information.
I suspect the culture of disregard for the law, disregard for minutes, disregard for how we appoint special advisors has permeated many facets of government, and I think the civil service have not been as robust as I would have expected them to have been in saying, no, we will not do that. We will not go there. We have standards to maintain. And sadly, they seem to have been very flexible in regard to holding a line against ministerial pushing of the boundaries way beyond where they should have gone.
At his evidence to the inquiry, David Sterling suggested an overhaul of the SPAD system. A former Stormont regulator is Felicity Houston. She believes that as well as any reform of the SPAD system, the inquiry pointed up the need for fundamental changes to the whole civil service.
I just think the population's attitude would be that David should get his own house in order first before he started pointing fingers at other people, though the SPADs are technically civil servants, and I think he's been asked for views, but it's we should consider having a review. It's hardly dynamic change, is it? And how long is that going to take? And if that's his attitude with the SPADs, how long is it going to take? Are we going to review the culture of the civil service?
If you look at the RHI inquiry, it was poor advice from the civil service that has caused the huge policy cock-up with all the financial implications that have stemmed from that.
The repeated blows to the credibility of the civil service appear not to have concerned the Secretary of State. With Stormont mothballed and a backlog of decisions building, Karen Bradley recently rushed through new legislation to give it even more power.
Faced with the reality of the situation I have to do what I consider to be best for the people of Northern Ireland to ensure that their public services can continue and that civil servants can continue to make the essential decisions in the public interest that they need to take.
The lesson from RHI is that you would, if anything, reduce the extent to which civil servants are involved in policy decisions because they weren't getting it right.
After Spotlight revealed the scale of the RHI crisis, David Stirling was promoted to his current role as head of the civil service. He has apologised for the civil service's role, but remains in post.
I have to acknowledge that multiple failings, multiple mistakes were made, and that we should have done better.
As we've seen, the first key point in RHI was the setting up of the scheme in 2012 in Arlene Foster's Department of Enterprise. The second key point was the summer of 2015, when officials at that department began to realise the scheme was hemorrhaging cash. David Stirling had moved on and been replaced at Enterprise by this man, Andrew McCormick. Arlene Foster had moved on too, leaving McCormick to deal with a new minister, Jonathan Bell, and his special advisor, Timothy Cairns. If he thought these two would make life easier, he was in for a shock. Picture the scene: a hotel restaurant in London, a minister and his closest advisor having breakfast, getting ready for a meeting. They've only been in post together for about a month. And let's just say things haven't started too well.
You're going to listen to me, big balls.
This is what Timothy Cairns is alleged to have uttered to Mr. Bell in that meeting, as an argument escalated to an ugly confrontation. Cairns disputes how he used the term big balls and says Jonathan Bell threatened him in return.
He said, if you wag your finger at me again, I'll break it. The allegation that I tried to break a finger or any other bone or attempted to is untrue, completely without foundation, and there's no basis whatsoever. In fact, I have never tried to break anybody's finger and never would.
He says that he felt under physical threat. Do you think that he did? And if he did, do you think it was warranted?
I have never indicated or sought to indicate anybody that I would inflict physical violence upon them. Never.
Andrew McCormick found himself in the middle of this dynamic, gaining a rapid insight into the scale of the DUP dysfunction that he would face over the next 18 months.
The evidence I shall give to this inquiry
will be the truth, the whole truth.
Bell's former colleagues now claim that he should never have been in the job in the first place.
Thank you. Do sit down.
It wasn't that Jonathan wasn't capable. I think it was more, my sense of it was that the effort wasn't always put in.
He saw it as a role where he was to be served rather than to serve, and therefore I thought he was an appropriate person to be a minister.
Jonathan Bell said he had to fix a shambles that Arlene Foster created, and that his former colleagues are ganging up on him as the RHI fall guy.
I think the Jonathan Bell saga shows the capacity of the DUP to marginalise those who they think aren't working in the party interest. You know, blame Bell was one of the key themes of the RHI Inquiry.
But Mr. Bell faced criticism not only from the DUP, but also from the man who was his most senior civil servant.
In September 15, his comment was, if you're happy, I'm happy, which is not a comfortable place for a civil servant to be, because part of the whole point is to have both official and political oversight of decision making.
So Andrew McCormick doesn't seem to have had much faith in Jonathan Bell either, but it's emerged that In the summer of 2015, some of Andrew McCormick's own civil servants were part of the problem. The civil service was trying to fix the scheme by introducing cost controls. But some civil servants were leaking information about those pending cost controls to businesses. There was then a huge spike in applications before the cost controls could be introduced, and that made a big problem far worse. SPADs were another problem for Andrew McCormick in that period. The inquiries heard that in that summer of 2015, special advisors, including Arlene Foster's special advisor Andrew Crawford, were meddling over the introduction of cost controls. Andrew Crawford appears, like some civil servants, to have been under the misconception that the Treasury was paying come what may under a system called Annual Managed Expenditure, or AME. And a year later, even after the Audit Office showed that that misconception was a blunder, Andrew Crawford was said to have appeared unconcerned.
It was a smiling Andrew Crawford having a relaxed conversation with me where he said, I thought this was Amy and we could fill our boots.
This is a direct conversation.
Yes, direct conversation with Andrew.
Just a couple of months later, Spotlight would expose the consequences of Andrew Crawford's blundering mindsets. The programme also prompted different factions within the DUP to go to war, once again sucking Andrew McCormick right into the middle. A familiar face was back in touch. Jonathan Bell, since sacked as a minister by Arlene Foster, was seeking to absolve himself of any blame for RHI, and accompanied by a spiritual advisor, he went to a meeting with Andrew McCormick and secretly taped the conversation to bolster his own position.
I was just shocked by the thought of having been recorded. Hadn't been concentrating on what I was saying because it just seemed a very informal conversation, and therefore, apprehensive. Had I said something outrageous or derogatory in an unguarded moment, and given that the atmosphere that week, this is after Spotlight, the Nolan Show were ramping up the media spotlight, the media attention on the whole issue. I think certainly the level of anxiety and fear went up several notches when I received Jonathan Bell's email the following Tuesday, was it, saying he was going to take the tapes to the public domain.
By the power of the Holy Spirit, you'll come upon Jonathan and those who interview him, that you will direct them.
A few days later, Jonathan Bell, again accompanied by the same spiritual advisor, was interviewed by the BBC's Stephen Nolan.
Of money. That's what my permanent secretary is telling me. He is clear that the reason the scheme was delayed on the record was because of the outside influences and interferences of the DUP special advisors.
Jonathan Bell had secretly recorded Andrew McCormick before this interview. In early 2017, as the media continued to focus on whether DUP SPADs had tried to frustrate cost controls, Andrew McCormick was again the victim of the party's dark tactics. But this time, it was his current minister at work. Simon Hamilton and allegedly his SPAD, John Robinson, sought to divert attention from DUP SPADs onto how civil servants had leaked documents, by themselves leaking documents, incriminating those civil servants both to the media and to a man sitting just feet away, their own permanent secretary, Andrew McCormick.
John is telling me that it has, he has sent it to Dr. McCormick, and this is anonymously, an envelope, sent it to Dr. McCormick, and also sent it to a journalist, and I think one other as well. So now I am aware.
To your own permanent secretary?
Yes, it's also to him.
Anonymously?
Yes.
I just want to be clear, I heard that.
Yes.
So why were you doing that? Why were you trying to take the pressure off a SPAD, a part-time, a person who's really responsible to the party, Why are you taking the pressure off him and putting it on just ordinary civil servants for whom you are responsible as a minister?
I understand that, you know, it is not a.
But I wouldn't imagine it one of your proudest moments.
That was the exact word I was going to use. It is not. It is the only answer I can give is in the context of the time.
I found it fascinating evidence because I was one of the individuals who got this leak, albeit I had no idea who it came from because it just landed on my desk in an envelope that came through the Royal Mail. I can't say I was terribly shocked by it because that sort of Machiavellian behaviour is the sort of behaviour that I would have characterised with some of these individuals.
The idea that a minister would agree with his SPAD to leak anonymous emails to the media to try and deflect really from himself and the party, I just thought that was quite extraordinary. And I suppose maybe we should give him credit for actually admitting it. But I mean, Simons was always seen as the great shining hope of the DUP, you know, First Minister in waiting at some point. But I would have thought after that particular revelation, everybody in the party would be thinking very differently.
Simon Hamilton's evidence was after John Robinson's, and Mr. Robinson has not responded publicly to the allegations. Simon Hamilton's admission wasn't the only 11th hour dramatic revelation at this inquiry. This time it related to one of the big questions that this inquiry has been wrestling with, whether DUP SPADs frustrated the introduction of tariff controls in the summer of 2015. And this time the question focused on the man dubbed the ace of SPADs, Timothy Johnston. Johnston was alleged by another SPAD, Timothy Kearns, to have had a conversation with him about RHI early in that summer. And crucially, Kearns said that Johnston told him that tariff controls should not be introduced.
How sure are you that he said to you at that time, tariff controls must not be introduced?
That's my recollection. I'm not going to go to the sword on it, Mr. Chair.
But at his first appearance at the inquiry, Johnston was absolutely adamant that he hadn't said that tariff controls should not be introduced.
I've been very clear about it. It's not a case of saying, well, I don't think, and I might have done this and I might have done that. I've been very clear that I think Mr. Kearns is wrong. I respect the fact that he has a different recollection. I don't know why he has that recollection.
Johnston not only said that that conversation didn't happen, but he also suggested that in that summer of 2015, he barely knew what RHI was. But on the day before Johnston's second appearance at the inquiry, Kearns provided an email at the 11th hour which cast doubt on that claim. It's from Kearns to Johnston in August, and it suggests that there had been contact between the two of them before that, and that the contact had been significant.
We also need to get a catch-up on renewable heat. If we are to deviate from GB policy, it will require a ministerial direction.
The chair put it to Timothy Johnston that Mr. Kearns' new evidence cast doubt on his version of events.
Now, the possibilities are he has got that out of the air and is just putting it down in the hope that you have some response. The other, and I suggest the more probable one, is that he's putting it there because there has been an exchange at some stage between you and Mr. Kearns. And the one that jumps out of the evidence so far is his evidence that you told him there will be no tariffs.
Which, from my point of view...
Which you have denied.
Correct.
But on this email, that fits.
As we've just seen, the emergence of that email at the 11th hour led to intense questioning of Timothy Johnston's claim that in that summer of 2015, he barely knew what RHI was. But there are also serious questions about how and why that email only emerged so late in the day. And that's because the inquiry, using its legal powers, required both Timothy Johnston and the DUP separately to hand over everything they had in relation to RHI, including all emails and texts. So if the man who sent the email, Timothy Kearns, was able to hand it over to the inquiry, why was the man who received it, Timothy Johnston, not able to? And why did the DUP not hand it over either?
The inquiry wrote to the DUP asking for everything that was relevant to the inquiry's terms of reference. When it comes to emails, that involves obviously searching for certain terms, RHI, renewable heat. Those are the sorts of terms that would be searched for. This would have been caught by one of those searches, but it didn't come into the inquiry.
Now the question that I have is, where was that email all this time? Why did it not emerge to the very last minute? Who was concealing it? Who amongst those compelled to produce such emails had decided not to produce it? Who thought they could get away with hiding it? And if that was hid for so long, what else has been hid? Because it strikes me as odd that that would be the only email out of the blue on this subject without it being part of a chain. And I trust the panel will be vigorous and rigorous in getting to the bottom of that.
We asked the DUP and Timothy Johnston why they had not provided this email to the inquiry. They said because the inquiry is still ongoing, including gathering more evidence, it is not appropriate to engage on the matters raised by Spotlight. This programme understands that the inquiry wrote to several DUP figures last week, seeking further information. Timothy Johnston, unlike some of the other SPADs who have since been rooted out, lives on as DUP Chief Executive.
Some short comments and then we'll take some questions in orderly fashion.
The witness examination sessions at the RHI Inquiry have now concluded. There will be legal submissions next month, and after that the inquiry will draw up its findings. In the meantime, the post-Stormont political regime limps on. The civil service now more powerful than before, and many questions about the future of Northern Ireland's biggest unionist party, and particularly where this inquiry will leave Arlene Foster. Sinn Féin has said it will work with her as First Minister, but will she still be DUP leader?
I think that Arlene Foster's career is now essentially in the hands of Sir Patrick Coughlin and Damien O'Brien. What comes out in this report will define how long she is allowed to stay as DUP leader, but I think that she is irrevocably damaged by what has happened here. Even if this is the weakest of criticisms that it can possibly be in terms of what the final outcome of this is, what has emerged so far has damaged her, I think, in the eyes of not just her own party, but those who would have to work with her in any future executive.
Because of the DUP's position at Westminster propping up the Tory government amid the Brexit negotiations, the party is now being discussed in the corridors of power all over Europe. But in this room, its dirty laundry has been aired in public, revealing conflict, dysfunction, a party in turmoil. The questions now for the DUP are how it will fix this damage to its reputation and how it will rebuild trust with the civil service, with other parties, with the electorate, and within the DUP itself.